growth in unemployment for a whole period of time. It's going to be what everybody's experiencing: increased brutality in the workplace, managers pushing workers harder, faster to discipline them, faster to take action against them. People who demonstrate and protest facing the kind of brutality that the Sussex University students faced, where they were dragged out by the riot police as a result of the desperation of management to carry through cuts, a more brutal situation. And of course, the question of the cuts that are coming. And they are going to be like nothing we've ever seen before. There are already cuts. University funding's been cut. Civil servants, preparation for beyond the general election, trying to get lower redundancy terms now so they can get rid of people after the general election. 70% of public sector managers say that they have carried out cuts in their workplace this year. So there's already cuts right across the board, but there is no doubt that it is going to get worse. It really is. Or at least it might be, because there's been some very big contracts in history, but it really might be the biggest contract ever. The banksters, the City of London, gambled these huge sums, built up these huge debts, and the state, taxpayers' money, has bailed them out, and now you have the situation where they're back getting £40 billion bonuses, 1.3 billion for the Royal Bank of Scotland alone, which is funded with taxpayers' money to the tune of 83%. So they're back laughing, and meanwhile, that debt is going to be paid off in cuts in public services and a tax on workers' pay and conditions. What is going to come after the general election will be much worse even than we saw under Thatcher. Even Thatcher did not carry out absolute cuts in public spending. It only actually happened twice in the 20th century. The second was at the end of the Second World War. But the first was called the Geddes Report, the Axeman Geddes, who tried to cut public spending by a quarter at the start of the 1920s, and those vicious cuts were part of what led to the 1926 general strike. And there's no question, the scale of cuts that are coming, we will see mass opposition to those when they take place. Even though, when you read opinion polls now, some of them give like 60% of people who think there should be some cuts in public spending. But that's when they're imagining there's some bureaucrats who are going to be cut, or maybe Trident or something that we want cutting is going to be cut. When it comes to their jobs, their pensions, their schools, their hospitals, people are going to be angry and are going to want to do something about it. Greece, if you like, will come to Britain. Now, if that would be the case, even if there were no militant trade unions, even if the trade union and socialist coalition didn't exist, there would still be big opposition to the cuts. But that doesn't mean that we've got no role to play. This coalition is playing an important role of saying clearly, we are against all cuts in public services, and we are going to fight to unite the campaigns to defend the public sector. Because big business and whatever government we get, they're not stupid. They will try and divide us amongst ourselves. They're already doing it, aren't they? Public sector workers against private sector workers. Young against old. Migrant workers against those that were born here. Even the idea of one public service against another. I mean, my local hospital, A&E, is threatened with closure. I went to the demonstration last weekend. The local Labour MP, Mike Gape, spoke and said, I'm completely against this being closed down. They should close the other A&E down, which is 3 miles down the road. I mean, you know, no MP is ever in favour of their own local service being cut, but they're quite happy to see the ones down the road being cut. So we have to fight for a united campaign. There's a comparison with the poll tax, actually. It's 20 years now since the poll tax was defeated. Some of you are probably too young to remember what the poll tax was, but it was a tax introduced by Maggie Thatcher, which was so iniquitous that a duke paid the same as a dustman or a railway worker or anybody else. And whatever had happened, there would have been mass opposition to it. But the role that socialists played, not least the predecessors of the Socialist Party, the militant at that time, the role that we played was organising, uniting the movement, so that in the end 18 million people refused to pay that tax, and we succeeded in getting rid of Thatcher. And we should be clear, the cuts are not inevitable. You read the newspapers of big business where they talk to themselves, like the Financial Times. They don't think they're going to be able to carry through the cuts in Greece. They're having discussions about the opposition from the Greek working class is too strong. Maybe some of them, maybe they should just come out the euro now. We're never going to get the cuts through. They may make out to us that cuts are inevitable, but in their own private discussions, they know differently. Actually, the Financial Times correspondent, Gillian Tett, who is being feted because she's one of the very few who knew there was going to be an economic crisis before it happened, possibly because she's actually an anthropologist, she's not an economist, so maybe she's got a bit more sense. But anyway, she was on Newsnight on this question of of cuts in public spending, and she blurted out the truth because she said it's not an economic question, it's a socio-political question, was how she put it. She said the issue is, can we carry through these cuts without creating a revolution? And all the politicians and the rest of the panel looked round at her like, what did you say that for? But she'd let the cat out of the bag. She'd let out the truth about the reality of the kind of movements that they will face. So this union, this coalition for the general election has a very important role to play in preparing the ground for those struggles beyond the general election. And that should include preparing people. We're going to need national demonstrations like the local one you had, but on a much bigger scale. The idea of united strike action across the public sector against the cuts when they come, and so on. But it's also, obviously, about offering a political alternative. Now, as I said earlier, there are undoubtedly some workers, particularly older workers, I think it's different with young people, who can remember the Tories, and even though they hate Labour, will feel that they've got no choice but to go out and vote for them. By the way, the Trade Union and Socialist Coalition takes no position on whether that's right or wrong, where we're not standing. Where we're standing, we think everybody should go out and vote for the Trade Unionists and Socialist Coalition. But there are some in the coalition who would argue you should vote Labour in the places where there's no left standing. There are others, the RMT, who will back those MPs who are actually fighting for the RMT's programme. In the Socialist Party, and it's correct that we take no position on that, it's up to the different parts of the coalition to decide what they want to do. It doesn't prevent us all working together. But in the Socialist Party, we would agree with the points that Bob made. We think the most important thing to do is to warn. Because a new Labour government, if they actually managed to get elected, would not do anything fundamentally different to what the Tories would do. The pace of cuts might be a little bit slower, but I've got to wind up. I'll just quote once more the Financial Times on New Labour's cut plans. They say the IMF in the 1970s, Thatcher in the 80s, John Major in the 90s, they were mice compared with the lions of Gordon Brown and Alistair Darling in their desire to curtail the role of the state in the cuts ahead. In other words, the Financial Times know New Labour would carry through cuts every bit as bad, in essence, as what the Tories are planning to do. Even the anti-trade union laws. It's true that the Tories are likely to move quite quickly on the question of particularly as facility time, the right of people to spend time working for the union in their workplace and make that worse than it is at the moment, and we'll have to resist that attack. But under a new Labour government, we've had the British Airways workers, after a democratic vote, being told by the courts that they're not allowed to go out on strike. The idea we have democracy for the trade unions under this government is an absolute farce. So, we think the most important thing we have to do is to warn that all three major parties stand for capitalism and for big business, and that what we're doing is preparing the ground, we believe, for the development of a party that stands up for working class people, a party that argues for socialism. And this will be my very last point, once again quoting the Financial Times. But there's an article in there today which begins by saying, the late Michael Foot would periodically claim, always wrongly, that the time was right for socialism. Ironically, it may now actually be right. Now, that's from a commentator in the Financial Times. And we believe he's right, actually. In the next few years, because of the reality, the brutal nature of 21st century capitalism, there will be opportunities to build mass support for socialist ideas. And this coalition is just the very beginning of that.
We're back, Dave.
I know what you're going to say.
Anna was there as well. we was up in London campaigning for No to You yesterday, the Ocracy, and Dave was up there with us. First time I ever met Dave.